What's up and welcome back to Interpreting Stars, where today we're taking a look at Crawl. Crawl is a 2019 action horror thriller film that centers around a young woman and her father as they attempt to survive in the middle of a hurricane. Here's the problem: they are trapped in a crawl space of their former home, which is quickly flooding due to the Category 5 hurricane outside, and they can't escape because they're not alone in that crawl space. At least two very massive and very hungry alligators are in there with them, watching and waiting. So it's practically impossible to talk about this movie without at least mentioning the film that comes to mind immediately, Sharknado. You have a natural disaster which ultimately brings monsters to the surface to attack us. Instead of a tornado, it's a hurricane. Instead of sharks, it's alligators. But weirdly enough, that's where the similarities end, because this film wasn't a joke, it was serious. Yes, the hurricane brought the gators, but it was dealt with in an intelligent way. It wasn't tacky where you see all these gators flying around in the crazy winds of a hurricane. Instead, the hurricane just acted as a doorway for the gators to find their way to these homes. Hurricanes flood the streets, and gators swim. It's that easy. So, as weird as it is, and as silly as it is to say, the method in which these gators arrived works. It's an incredibly thrilling film, which I surprisingly enjoyed from beginning to end. What this film does really well is mix together two very different subgenres. This is partially a monster movie, but it's also partially a disaster film. So it's both man versus beast and man versus nature at the same exact time. Two separate narrative conflict types that blend together really well. One thing that kept coming to my mind was, who was the antagonist in this movie? Was it the gators or was it the storm? I personally believe that the storm was the antagonist while the gators were contagonists, and here's why. In Star Wars, Vader was the antagonist, but he also had minions, which were stormtroopers, and they were contagonists. They kept the rebels in place while he continued on the path of the dark side. Same thing here, the storm was Darth Vader, wreaking havoc a little bit at a time, while the gators served as contagonists, keeping these two leads in a crawl space, letting the storm slowly kill them if they don't get out of that situation. Crawl utilizes a lot of smart filming techniques which contributes to the theme of the film, helping it achieve that thriller status. For instance, with the visuals, it utilizes just enough practical effects for certain gory moments when the gators attack, and just enough focus on production design to make the ordinary crawl space start to look more and more like another world as the alligators and hurricane really start to attack the foundation of this house. There's also a lot more focus on sound editing and mixing than you probably noticed, because a part of making the audience believe a hurricane is actually happening outside versus it just being special effects made to look like a hurricane is placing a lot of importance on sound. Billowing winds, crashing rain, so loud that when our characters speak outside, we can't hear them, which adds to the assumption that nobody can hear them scream when these alligators come a-knockin'. That being said, this film is also placed in the horror genre, in which I have to argue against. Alligators may be a frightening beast, but there's a difference between horror and thriller. Not all horror films are thriller films, so the same must be said about thriller films. Not all thriller films are horror, yet they're often paired together when maybe they shouldn't be. It's a pet peeve that I often get with films like this. This is an action thriller. It's not a horror film. There's maybe one moment in the entire movie where a gator shows up that I jumped, and that's it. It's not a scary movie, at least for me. Scary is a subjective adjective, and I get that. But I'd have to keep this locked in the thriller subgenre and forget any kind of horror expectations. In general, I would say that the film exceeded my expectations, which weren't incredibly high to begin with, but I was genuinely surprised. The performances were well done. The actors showed a good level of acting range when facing these impossible odds. Even though you had all of these terrible things happening, our characters didn't just sit back and observe them, like a lot of horror films often have. It had characters that were actively attempting to do something about it. They had a plan of action, or at least a plan B, plan C, so forth, when other plans fell through. So it had a nice sense of pace, there were solid obstacles. The only thing narratively that could have used a little help was the introduction, which felt really, really rushed. The only thing you know about her character before things start happening is that she's a strong swimmer. That's it! And you know from movie tropes that her ability to swim will be tested later because, look, you don't start a movie on the main character's strongest ability and ignore it. She's a strong swimmer. There's a hurricane. There are alligators, which are also strong swimmers. You can start building a mental image of what happens in the film after that point. At the end of the day, I did score this movie 74%, 74 out of 100 possible stars. It's not exactly a perfect film by any means, it's just incredibly entertaining, which is probably the only thing that it was trying to accomplish, honestly. If you're a fan of action thrillers, you'll probably have a great time with this movie. Is it gonna win any awards? Probably not. But that's not really the point either. Guys, tell me what you thought of Crawl in the comments down below. As for YouTube, make sure that you hit subscribe, hit the like button, hit the bell to be notified when I come out with my next review. But until then, peace out.